Hello there, boos and ghouls. It is once again October, which means it is my favorite season of the year. Halloween series 2024! Yay! So, this year, for Halloween, I am doing black horror, or horror noir, as it's sometimes called. In this case, I'm doing films, but this could be films, literature, media of any kind that focuses on the experience of black people. This may be African, this may be Afro-Caribbean, this may be African-American, and indeed the films that I'm going to be talking about for this series are all African-American driven films. Typically African-American majority, if not entire casts, often directed, written, whatever it is, produced by African Americans. And black horror tends to, though doesn't exclusively, tends to focus a lot on elements of race, racism, and the violence inherent in a racially hierarchized society. In this video for Halloween 2024, we're going to talk about Tim Story's film, The Blackening. This is a 2023 film that is sort of in the broad genre of horror, parody, comedy, this kind of thing. It's a satire that takes on a number of tropes very common to the horror genre, particularly slasher films, and it plays a lot with racial stereotypes of African Americans, depictions of African Americans in film and TV, along with issues of gender and sexuality. So the film is basically about this group of college friends who are sort of getting back together for a reunion / games night, and they have rented this cabin in the woods, or Morgan has rented this cabin in the woods. Morgan and her boyfriend, I think, husband possibly, but I think boyfriend, doesn't really matter, not important for the plot of the story. Morgan has rented this cabin in the woods. They are the first ones to get there, Morgan and Sean, and they sort of explore the house, typical, we've just arrived at our vacation destination type stuff. And they find this door marked games room. So they go in, and they find a bunch of games there, which is very convenient for a games night style party. But they find this one particular game called The Blackening, which visually is quite racist. The sort of centerpiece of it is a little black Sambo face figurine. And there are pieces for each of them. There are pieces sort of representative of each of the people who's going to be there in some way. So an earring exactly like the earrings Morgan is wearing. For King, it's a crown. For Shanika, it's a bottle, because she drinks a lot. So there's some sort of game piece for each of the characters. But before everyone else can arrive, the speaker in the little black Sambo figure challenges Sean and Morgan to pick a card. They have to answer the question correctly or they die, is the premise of the game. They do not answer the question correctly, and so this sort of Leatherface type character somewhat reminiscent of things like Texas Chainsaw Massacre, which actually does get mentioned as some of the other characters are driving out into the woods. One of the characters, I think it's Dwayne, but I'm not 100% sure. I could be wrong about that. Says, is it just me? Something like, is it just me, or is this giving Texas Chainsaw Massacre? So there is that sort of connection. Again, this is a very referential film that's very interested in the tropes of the horror genre, that's interested in references to horror, the stereotypes of horror. But anyway, so this sort of Leatherface guy with black leather. So in that sense, it does differ from Texas Chainsaw Massacre, where Leatherface wears a sort of beige, natural leather type hood. And it differs so that it can be more racist. So this is black leather hood with sort of exaggerated racist caricature, African-American lips drawn on it, etc., etc. So again, we're just continuing the visual theme of racist iconography. Anyway, so Leatherface fires so the lights go out, Leatherface fires a crossbow bolt into the room, killing Sean. He then captures Morgan, and when the others arrive, Allison, Clifton, King, Shanika, Dwayne, Lisa, and Namdi, Clifton is sort of the odd person out in this group because he later claims that Morgan had invited him, but nobody else had expected that he was going to be there. So there's this sort of weird question about his status and whether or not he's actually part of the group. But they all arrive, they're hanging out, they're doing drugs, they're playing games, mostly spades, and apparently a lot of their culture revolves around spades. I don't have a good sense of how typical that is of African-American culture or regional African-American cultures, but in the film, it's a big, big deal for them. And this is actually where one of the sort of interesting themes of the film gets introduced. This idea of, well, it doesn't get introduced here. It gets introduced in a number of places, including when Lisa gets called out for having a white father. But this idea of not being black enough is a big sort of running theme in the film. And of course, a lot of the stuff in the film revolves around African-American pride. This is a Juneteenth celebration. I forgot to mention that. It's not crucial for the actual movement of the story. It's sufficient to know that it's a games night / college reunion, but it is a Juneteenth party. The characters are all very proud of being African-American, etc., etc. So, yeah. But this question of being black enough or being really black comes up over and over again. And it's an important thematic component. And as we get toward the end of my sort of discontinuous plot summary here, you'll find out why. So they're hanging out, they're doing stuff. Good sort of like reliving our college days type stuff. They're catching up. Both Namdi and King tell each other that they have changed their questionable ways of youth. Namdi used to cheat on women a lot, to have multiple girls, etc., etc. He is now settled down to one girl, Allison, as we will find out later in the film. And King had been a gangster. He is now out of that. So there are all these sort of questions, all these sort of things about whether or not people have changed, etc., etc. And that's an important thematic as well.
So anyway, they're doing that stuff. That stuff happens for a while. It builds character. It sets the scene, etc., etc. And then they find the games room. They are challenged by the Blackening to pick a card. And for them, for the larger group, the rules are slightly different. They have to answer 10 questions correctly or Morgan will be killed. And they're shown Morgan on a TV screen with the Leatherface guy in there with her. And so they're answering the questions. They get up through, I think they get the first 9 questions correct, and then they blow it on the 10th because the 10th is set up as a kind of trick question. I think it's 4 characters. They have to name 4 African-American actors or characters who were on the show Friends. And they each start by saying, I never watched it, but I know that X character was on in this capacity. So they do manage to list 4, but the game says, sorry, the correct answer was, I never watched that show. So Leatherface attempts to kill Morgan. She ends up escaping, but then she does get killed anyway. The rest of the group try and save her, and then they basically say, we're not going to play this game anymore. And so the game says, all right, then I'm going to give you, well, Leatherface says, all right, I'm going to give you a head start, and then I'm going to hunt you all down. So basically that's what happens. We get that element of it. And they break up into 2 groups, and there is an extensive bit where Lisa basically sort of acknowledges that what she's about to say is probably a terrible idea. And then she says, I think we should split up. And they're all like, no, that's the whitest suggestion you could have made. Why would you do that? And of course, this is a big horror trope as well. The whole, we're splitting up, which just means we all get killed individually. So they all go their separate ways. At one point, they sacrifice Clifton, partially because he's not really part of the group, but he also says that he had voted for Trump twice. So that is basically what tips them over the edge. And at the insistence of the game, they sacrifice Clifton. But then it sort of says, the game says that didn't fit the rules, etc., etc. So there's all this stuff. And basically, they're getting hunted down. They're fighting Leatherface, and they come to realize that there's 2 Leatherfaces. Because one goes after the group that goes out into the woods, and Lisa actually ends up killing him. Basically, she's like Wolverine style, like takes 3 of the crossbow bolts and is just like stabbing him repeatedly in different parts of his body until he's dead. So it's a pretty awesome fight scene, as fight scenes go. Then they go back toward the house. There is another Leatherface who's been going after the other group, and ultimately Allison, so Dwayne shoots him with the crossbow, but ultimately Allison just clubs him to death brutally with a it's a pedestal thing, a little post. I don't know how to describe it necessarily. Yeah, so that was her weapon of choice when they were all going and finding weapons to defend themselves. Allison had grabbed this wooden thing, and she ends up just absolutely wrecking this guy, just going full out like berserker, and just to the point where everybody else who's standing around watching this is just horrified and just in terror at the brutality of what she has done to this guy. So they check their IDs, the Leatherface's IDs, and they realize that they are the twin brothers who own the cabin. The cabin that they had rented. So they think they're now safe. Turns out they aren't, because they sort of go downstairs to the master control room where they had been sort of watched all evening, all that stuff. Clifton's body is down there. And Clifton's not dead, as it turns out. It turns out that actually Clifton is the mastermind behind all of this. And the reason that he has decided to brutally kill them in this sort of weird horror game parody fashion is because 10 years ago at a Juneteenth party, they had made fun of him and questioned his blackness because he made a mistake at spades. And so he got very drunk, he drove, and he killed someone and then served 4 years in prison. Eventually, they do manage to kill Clifton. They manage to overpower him and defeat him, throw his body down a well, the place that he has been disposing of the bodies of mostly Sean and Morgan by this point. And so they win in the end. In contrast to the implication at the beginning of the movie, where Sean and Morgan are challenged to name one black character who has survived a horror movie, parenthetically, Son of Ngagi, which I did a video about last week, full of black characters who survive. So they are unable, but Sean and Morgan are unable to name one. So the implication, of course, is this very common element of especially 70s and 80s slasher flicks, that black characters always die. This is one of the sort of horror tropes that is confronted in this film, because actually the three white characters we meet, the two twins, Clive and Camden Connor, whose names I didn't give you, and Ranger White, they all die. But most of the black characters in the film survive. Clifton dies, though maybe, because as we get the sort of long tracking shot panning down the well toward the end, we hear a laugh from the well, so maybe he doesn't. And I think there are rumors of a sequel to this, but I don't know whether that's been confirmed. I haven't followed up on it. But Clifton implicitly dies. Sean and Morgan die, but all of the other black characters survive. So it challenges that stereotype, obviously. But again, we've got all of these other sort of tropes, ideas of what happens in slasher flicks. Cabin in the woods, creepy redneck killers, the we should all split up trope, the finding weapons but never any actual weapons. The killer uses, in this case, not a bladed weapon necessarily, but a crossbow, which is a sort of bladed weapon. The seeming invulnerability of the killer, all of the sort of spooky supernatural slasher stuff is all sort of set up and lampooned in this film. It's really, really clever. It's really, really funny. It's not massively scary, not massively terrifying, but I also don't know that it's supposed to be. I think it's supposed to be smart and funny more than it's supposed to be scary.